Thanks for listening to the Drummers Weekly Groovecast. You can contact the show at twitter.com/DW Groovecast and through Facebook at facebook.com/Drummers Weekly Groovecast.
Good evening.
I am warning you right now, if you touch my drums, I will stab you in the neck with a knife.
Ain't a bucket. Ain't a bucket.
Mom!
Take it easy. Lower it.
I'm not gonna lower it. I have to do this now.
I don't mind you playing it, but lower it.
Everything is straightened out?
No, we had a problem. I mean, we tried to do everything we could.
What do you mean?
Well, you know what I mean.
Little trouble there. You're rushing.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
Yeah.
Happy almost 1 year anniversary, Groovecast Nation. I was corrected recently by listeners telling me that week 52 is really not your 1 year anniversary. It's really going to be week 53, so I'm not going to argue. I'm going to go with it. We're going to give you a little early anniversary gift. This is our paper anniversary, but yet we're going to give you some bronze if you catch my drift. Basically, folks, when you are presented with a chance to speak with a giant in the drumming industry, you take it. And boy, we were presented with that opportunity this past week, and we took full advantage of it. Today, we humbly present part one of a two-part series with today's guest, John DeChristopher, former vice president of Zildjian Cymbals. You know, it's that little old company up in Norwell, Massachusetts that you might have heard of. You might own one or two pieces of their wares. John is just an incredibly nice and just unquestionably genuine guy. He is going to detail his bio about how he started playing drums, his love for music, how it eventually morphed into becoming someone on the industry side or on the manufacturer side of drumming. He's going to tell you about his first job of working as a drum department manager in a store in Boston, how it led to him moving to Los Angeles and eventually working for the Simmons Drum Company. That in turn found his way over to Drum Workshop in the very early days of Drum Workshop, even before they were marketing drums to the public, and then his eventual move back east, where he started his long and very famous tenure with the Zildjian family. I think that one of the things that best illustrates what you're going to love about this interview, aside from everyone's natural love of gear, because boy, we sure do talk about gear, nuts and bolts. But how about this? John is going to detail stories and personal relationships throughout this interview with some folks like Tony Williams, Steve Smith, Vinnie Colaiuta, Peter Erskine, David Robinson, Charlie Watts, Dennis Chambers, Steve Gadd, Greg Bissonette, Danny Serafin, J.R. Robinson, Jeff Porcaro, and Chester Thompson. And folks, that's just on the drumming artist side of things. He also has great stories and great memories of these industry legends on the manufacturing side. Don Lombardi, John Good, Armin Zildjian, Craigie Zildjian, Lenny DiMuzio, Mike Morse, Paul Francis, and Vic Firth. And I'm telling you, I'm leaving out people. This is an epic interview for those of you who are gearheads and just general drumming nerds. This is a gold mine of an interview. So without any further delay, let's get right into part one of John DeChristopher.
John, we can't thank you enough for joining us. I have been beyond excited to just chew the fat with you on a perspective that many of us don't get in this business. You have had in droves. Let's just get to it early on here. Kind of give us a little background on you as far as, how you got interested in music and, drumming in particular. What brought all that on?
Sure. Well, I think like a lot of people, I started off as a drummer. When I say a lot of people that sort of ended up in the business side of it, I started as a drummer, started playing at age 11, 45 years ago this summer. Nice. I had a paper route and I used to go out and, like a lot of kids, I bought my first pair of drumsticks and anyway, that turned into playing in a couple of bands as a teenager and all through high school and, really trying to pursue a professional career as a drummer, which led me to, after high school, I was all set to go to Berklee, basically. I was all but there. And I accepted a job at a music store in Boston called EU Wurlitzer Music, which was right around the corner from Berklee, in fact. And it's no longer there, but it was the store in Boston. It was like a smaller version of Manny's. And in that, and I figured I'd just sort of hang there for a while and still play with my band, and eventually I'd make my way to Berklee or someplace. And that just led to meeting all these people. And I'm kind of giving you the condensed version, but my first, big job in the drum industry, which was Simmons Electronic Drums, was the result of meeting Glenn Thomas, who was the guy that was running the operation in the U.S. I met him while I was at Wurlitzer. We were the first store to take on Simmons in 1982, and that created this, we developed a friendship, Glenn and myself, and so 3 years later, when I was ready to move out to LA and really try to pursue being a drummer, Glenn gave me my first job. He said, if you come out here, I'll have a job for you. You'll have a place to land on your feet.
Nice.
Awesome. So, John, you mentioned that you had an opportunity to go to Berklee up in Boston. So somewhere prior to that, you obviously did some formal study. And we know that Boston is a tremendously fertile ground for great education. Who did you study with, and what did you work on?
Well, I actually, I was self-taught. I started off as a self-taught drummer, and a very good friend of mine named Fred Klein studied with Alan Dawson. He was he was taking lessons right from the beginning and got to the point where he was a good enough player that Alan Dawson accepted him as a student. And that was probably around my senior year in high school, 1977, 1978. And so I started taking lessons from Fred, planning my because I couldn't get into Berklee unless I had some level of being able to read music, which I couldn't do up until that time. So I did take some lessons from Fred, and I got the basics to reading, I can't honestly say that I had real formal studies because, you'd only have to see me play for 5 minutes to know that I'm self-taught. It's
well, we
in progress.
We know you're a lefty, man. That's one thing. Yeah.
It all started there. But I will tell you, without spending too much time on that, I was lucky to grow up at a time that the scene, where I lived in Boston, in the 70s and in the 80s, it was such a fertile scene. There were so many opportunities for bands to play. So I feel really fortunate. And that, I think, if I didn't have those opportunities, I might have given up on playing the drums sort of earlier, and I probably wouldn't have ended up where I ended up. But it was all those sort of roads connecting one to another. The fact that I had a very active sort of playing career from 13 or 14 into my 20s, when I finally thought, Boston's a great town. I've played with a lot of different people and in a few different bands, and it's maybe just time to go out to a place like LA where there's obviously a lot of great drummers, there's a lot of great musicians, but many more opportunities. So that was the thinking there. But yeah, my dream was I didn't intend to sort of end up working in the industry, and I'm thankful that I had that career that I had there. But I think like a lot of us, my initial dream was to go out and be a working drummer.
A rock star. Come on, just say it.
Come on, rock star. Why not?
Yeah.
That is the perfect segue, John. I was going to ask you that if this business side was also an equal interest, but it sounds almost like that it was kind of like it was the proverbial collateral damage to your to your performing career.
Well, yeah, I mean, I realized working at Wurlitzer, I actually, I did really well there. Within a year or so, I was promoted to the manager of the drum department, and it was only in my early 20s, and I really loved that job at a time, for a while there anyway. It was a fun place to work, a lot of great musicians. I was still able to play with my band, and a lot of the people that worked there, guitar players, keyboard players, all were working musicians as well. So it was a great vibe in the shop, in the store. All the bands from Boston used to shop there back at that time, like Aerosmith and the Cars. The Cars actually had a studio literally across the street, and I'll tell you a quick story about that in a second. But Jay Giles' band. So I mean, I got to know a lot of people. I actually met Armin Zildjian for the first time working at Wurlitzer. I mentioned Glenn Thomas, which led to my job there. Lenny DiMuzio, a lot of Vic Firth, used to come in and literally hand deliver the drumsticks and mallets on his way to Symphony Hall to do a gig with the orchestra, Boston Symphony Orchestra. So it was a great time, and a lot of great relationships and friendships were developed very early on. But anyway, I was going to just tell you a quick story about the Cars. So they used to come in all the time, and David really didn't have any endorsements with companies. He would buy cymbals, he would buy drum heads, and sticks and that sort of thing. So when we had Simmons, the SDS-5 kit, the deal we made with Glenn was if we bought this kit COD, Glenn would come from LA to Boston and do a demo, do a clinic, because it was such a new kind of innovative thing that I knew that I couldn't just sort of open it up and know what to do with it. So Glenn, we had this arrangement. Glenn comes in, and immediately we hit it off. He's a great guy, and he'd been sort of all over the place, New York, and he was just the drums were starting to happen. You were hearing him on like Duran Duran records, and David Robinson was using Syn drums and all those electronics that were the popular electronics of that time. So he was very interested. So he and his drum tech and maybe 25 or 30 other people came to this clinic on a Monday night. And I remember we had the electronic drum set up through an amp or maybe a small PA. And Glenn did a great job, and David and his tech hung out and watched. And the next day they came back, just the two of them, and said, "Can we fool around with this thing for a while?" I had it set up in the drum department now. And so I'm trying to remember some of the things Glenn had showed me. And, when you think about it now, it's such basic stuff. But at that time, like, pitch bend and decay. And, I was learning what all these different things did. And so we messed with it for about an hour or so, and they left. A little while later, his tech came back and said, "We're going to take it. Can you put it on our account, and let's pack it up and we'll take it." So we sold that kit within a day or two of having it. And Glenn was already in New York or something, maybe doing another one of these things. And he called me and said, "I heard you sold the kit to the Cars." And I said, "They must have registered their warranty or something." And he was already on to selling another one. And that created, over the next couple of years, this friendship. So when I made the call and said, I'm thinking of coming to California, I'm not foolish enough to think the day I get there I'm going to get a big gig, but could I work there? And he said, we need good people, and we're growing, and I'd find a place for you somewhere. I could use your help. So
awesome. And John, do you recall what was the price of that Simmons kit that you sold, David?
I want to say the COD price to us, we had to buy it COD. I think it was like $2,000, and it might have been. Yeah, I know, and I think it listed around $2,900 or over $3,000. But they were selling. I mean, once we started selling a couple, there were a lot of people coming in and buying them, because you had to have that. That was the sound that people wanted on their records. It was definitely a thing.
Awesome. So, John, you made the trip out to LA then.
Yeah.
And you obviously contacted Glenn from Simmons. What position did you start out at when you got out there?
When I got there, I started, I want to say the first week I was there, he had me moving around doing a lot of different things. I was sort of, I don't know that they had a real dedicated customer service, but I was like, I knew the product well enough that they could put me on the phone and answer questions from consumers or stores, dealers that had questions about the SDS-7, which was the top of the line model by that time. But I'd say within a couple of weeks, I was working in a sort of artist relations role, working with drummers, LA drummers that were coming in and picking up, this or that, or had questions about the product. And within the first few weeks of working there, I met Vinny. I remember he came in early on in my time there, but like John Robinson, Jerry Brown, Chester Thompson, we were doing all these clinics with these guys, and I was organizing the clinics.
That was the first clinic I saw was with John.
Okay. Yeah. Was it around 85, 86?
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, like some of my longest and, sort of longest friendships and best friends, like Greg Bissonette, Danny Serafin, Myron Grombacher. I met all those guys like in 1985. We laugh about it. We think, my God, we met all those years ago, and it's just, it's a great thing. I think it's a great tribute to like how a real friendship is, it's lasts all those years, but in a short amount of time, I felt very comfortable there. And I think that's the case for most anyone that works in that sort of a position, that you overcome that, whatever nervousness you might feel in terms of meeting one of your heroes, and I remember the first time I met Terry Bozzio, who was a big hero of mine at that time. And he was just such a nice guy. He was just such a regular, engaging, really nice guy that had sort of put all that aside, and you just, you go on with your business. You realize, okay, well, I'm here to do a job, and maybe I'm at a studio delivering something, or they come in to see me, and you have to be professional and do what you're there to do.
Awesome, man. Do you, from your time, especially in artist relations, there's one guy, and this will tell you about my vintage of drumming in my childhood. Neil Peart became a Simmons player. Did you have a lot? Was he, first off, would you say that he was probably the biggest endorser at that time? And what was your relationship with him?
I didn't know Neil. I didn't meet him until I went to Zildjian. And I, to be honest, I forgot that he played Simmons but you're right, absolutely. Now, I was only at Simmons from 85 to 86. And the thing about Neil, too, is he almost 100% exclusively, certainly in those days, did everything through his drum tech. He wasn't a guy that was going to pick up the phone and say, have a question about my SDS-7. In fact, at that time, he had a drum tech named Larry Allen, who I remember when I started at Zildjian. Larry was still his tech. Now it's Lauren Wheaton, who I've known for a million years. He was Steve Smith's old drum tech, Lauren. But yeah, Neil probably was. He used them differently, obviously, because he still played his full acoustic kit, and then correct me if I'm wrong, but he had the full kit sort of behind him,
right,
and played it as a standalone. Whereas guys like, a lot of guys like JR and I mean a lot of these guys were playing these kits as a complete kit, almost exclusively as their main kit for recording sessions. They'd go in with, maybe they'd take an acoustic bass drum and an acoustic snare drum, but they'd be playing all Simmons toms for a certain record. And that was the thing for a while, and in fact, it became sort of a joke, because it was, at that time, guys like Vinny, even Jeff Beccaro, who didn't, God rest his soul, he didn't necessarily love electronics and didn't fully embrace them the way a lot of guys might have, but you had to go out and buy a rack of stuff, because producers expected you to come in there with samples of this and this sound, and it became sort of a well, I don't know, I wouldn't say it was the bane of their existence, but a lot of these guys felt like, oh man, now there's this other new thing that just came out, the SP12 by EMU Systems, and that's the hot machine sampler, and I've got to get one of those now, or this is obsolete. I've got to spend $2,000 on this because this is what they expect me to come in with. So, and that was maybe for a few years, that was the scene in LA with electronics.
Yeah, well, and then you also, you had the trappings of early technology also. I mean, I was just a kid when those things came out, but I knew some folks that had some Simmons pads, and I mean, they were, to be delicate about it, they were finicky at best, with triggering and phantom triggering and over triggering, and so yeah, I understand that.
I remember the tabletop,
like
the early pads. That, That was the
SDS5. The original had the Formica surface,
mm-hmm.
And the pros to that were that you could really play a great press roll, and you could play some really great clean sticking on it. But the cons being that it really would create some wrist and arm injuries over time, and
mm-hmm.
and it wasn't very fun to play in terms of the feel of that surface. But they did eventually go to the rubber pads, and they were a little better, and the tracking got better as they went along. And I had an SDS7, and that was the digital analog system. So you had sort of the best of both worlds with that one. And but it was a thing for a while, and I enjoyed using them on gigs. Gave you a lot of options for sounds. And
no doubt. So it was just a little over a year, maybe a year and a half.
Yeah,
at Simmons, and then you ended up getting an opportunity with Drum Workshop. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, and the way it worked out at Simmons was, so I was there from the summer of 1985,
mm-hmm.
and things were still booming. With Simmons, it was a hot product, and by the sort of early spring, of 1986, or certainly by the summer, things were slowing down in terms of just electronic drums. Yamaha had come out with their first electronic kit, Roland, some serious competition. The market itself had begun to sort of slow down, and I remember this too, because I attribute it almost exclusively to the fact that the music was changing. Like, you were seeing all these metal bands coming out now, and it went from everybody on MTV using Simmons pads to everybody playing double bass drums with, square-sized tom-toms, 13 by 13 and 14 by 14, and Paiste Rude cymbals and lots of hair, and so that became the thing. And all of a sudden, you saw electronic drums starting to drop off, and that's all Simmons did. Unlike Roland, who was, this massive company that happened to dabble in electronic drums, and of course Yamaha. So we were feeling it, and I was, by that time, in fact, I was working in the sales department. I'd moved over there within maybe about 3 or 4 months, and my background had really been in sales, and Glenn felt that's where I would better serve the company, and it was fine with me because I was making more money as a sales guy there. So anyway, so people were starting to be sort of laid off and let go because of the fact that the business was slowing down, and my first wife was pregnant with my son, and this was now August or September of 1986, and I had met Don Lombardi just through different events in LA and clinics and things like that, and I knew him as the DW guy, and I love your pedals, and just a nice guy, and he got my phone number from somebody. I remember coming home one night around 8 o'clock at night, and Don calls me. And have you ever met Don? He's the nicest guy on the planet. And if he hears this, he's going to probably strangle me. But he's got this voice like, "Hey, how you doing? Hey, it's Don. Hey, how are you? Hey." So, he's telling me how excited he is because they're really going to, we make acoustic drums. I didn't even know they made acoustic drums. And he said, "We've got a few guys using our drums: Jim Keltner, Chad Wackerman, John Hernandez from Oingo Boingo." He said, "But we really want to. There's an opportunity now." Now, keep in mind, this was 1986, and you had Gretsch hanging on by their thumbs. Ludwig was all but out of business at that point. Rogers and Slingerland were pretty much gone. And Don very astutely felt, it's really the Japanese companies now that are kind of running the show. And I think there's an opportunity for an American drum company, if it's done right and the quality's there and it's made in America. I think, the drums obviously have to sound good, but I think there's an opportunity, and we're looking for someone that could be a salesperson, an artist relations person. Your name was floated out there and I wanted to talk to you about it. So we talked about it and I agreed to come up to his shop, which was in Newbury Park at that time, just north of LA. And I want to say he called me on like a Friday night, and I went up the following Monday or Tuesday after work, after Simmons. And I met with Don and we had dinner, and I saw the shop, and it was a small place, and he showed me some of the drums and where all the hardware was made. And I just really liked him a lot. I liked his passion and I liked what he was about. I don't think I met John at that point, but John Good was still a drum tech kind of as a profession. He was working for Chad Wackerman. He was working for Jonathan Moffett. And the other piece of the puzzle that Don said is, the other part of this is I need to be able to make it right so that John can get off the road and be here full time. So kind of saying, you're going to need to sell enough drums so that I can make it worthwhile for John to be here to make the drums. And that's kind of how it really was in its infancy. I mean, it was Don and myself and John and a couple of women in the office that were answering the phones and accounts receivable. And so I ended up agreeing to take the job, and I started there in the fall of 1986, and we launched the drums in January of 87, 30 years ago at that Winter NAMM show. And that was the beginning of DW drums. And then, I stayed there another 2 years before I went to work for Zildjian. And I'll just sort of continue. So, I mean, my son was born in May of 87. And we were out there another year and a half or so. And it was just hard to be 3,000 miles from our family. And we were making lots of trips back and forth. And I finally went to Don and I said, I don't know that I want to be out here anymore. And is there a way I could still do this, but do it from the East Coast? So we got creative, and he said, yeah, I think we'll come up with a way to do this. And so I opened up an office, moved back east, opened up an office out of my house on the East Coast, and was basically at that time DW's East Coast office. And I was close enough to drive down to New York to Manny's and Sam Ash and down to Long Island. And I was this sort of East Coast sales artist relations arm of the company as it was still growing. And they brought somebody else into the West Coast to, kind of be in the office there. And at that time too, Don's son, Chris, who's now the CEO of the company, he graduated from high school. I was thinking about this when I knew I was going to be talking to you guys. Chris graduated from high school like the summer of 87 and came in, and I trained him. I mean, Don said, I'm going to have Chris come in and help you. You can't do all this yourself. He can answer the phones. He can help you with orders. And he was a teenager, and he was a little tough to manage at first, but he, over a period of time, sort of got it and started to understand it. And now I look at him, and he is literally the president of the company. I mean, he's an incredibly smart guy that's doing a great job there, And but I was going to say the running joke that Don and I have, is that it took me moving to the East Coast and then leaving DW to go to Zildjian for the company to really take off. That's what Don will, at every opportunity when we're together at the NAMM show, and he'll say, John here used to work for me out here, and the best thing he ever did was leave, because once he left, business exploded, So it was.
So early on, were you influential in bringing some artists on?
Yeah.
Because I think more than any other company, early in the game, DW really picked up. I mean, granted, they were in LA. They already had relationships with a lot of drummers by way of John's teching and that. But did they kind of ask you to rein in some people and get them interested? It
was like a team effort there too. And the funny thing too is that John and certainly in those early days, he was in the factory, he was in the shop making drums, and we shared an office, and he'd come in the morning and he'd get out his book and he'd make some phone calls, and he'd, maybe spend a half an hour, 45 minutes, and we'd shoot the breeze, and then he'd get out to the shop and he'd just nose to the grindstone. And not that he didn't want to interact with people, but I think he just felt like, that's your job. You're the artist relations guy. I'm not going to get in your way, and you don't get in my way because I'm going to be out here making drums. So I would have guys coming up, but I will tell you this. I'll back up a second and say that it was hard to get people interested in the very beginning, and I'm sure you guys can imagine that because you had Pearl, you had Yamaha, you had Tama. Pearl had an office in LA. They took very good care of their artists. They had probably the lion's share of the sort of rock metal drummers of that time, of like Tommy Lee and I think of like a guy like Ricky Rocket, who was one of the first. They were a popular band. Poison was popular at that time, and that was a big score when Ricky came over from Pearl, and that certainly got some attention. But it was hard to get their attention because they were well looked after. Between the product, we weren't in a position to make multiple drum sets and multiple finishes and give them to them for free. Most of the guys that we were signing, we were doing deals where they were paying, some sort of artist price, try to run it through pro drum shops so Stan didn't get bummed out. But sometimes I'd get a call from Stan and say, hey, I heard you signed up so-and-so, and he's one of my customers, and I actually quoted him a price on a DW kit, and now he tells me he's signed with you guys and he bought it direct. And so you have to be careful with those situations, because if you piss off your dealers, then you're totally cutting off your nose, and I've always been cognizant of that. You never want to bite the hand that feeds and cut your dealer off. But so there was a lot of that stuff. And to me, the first big guy that I was involved in bringing on was Danny Seraphin. And that was around 1987. And he was playing Yamaha at the time. He had played Slingerland, as you know, in the early Chicago days and well into the early 80s, all through the 70s, into the early 80s. And it got to the point where Slingerland just couldn't, they were practically out of business. Yamaha approached him, made a great drum, and he started playing their drums. And when he saw how close these DW drums were to, like, they were maple shells versus a birch shell, the sound was closer to what he was used to hearing, kind of in his head from the old days. So, and Chicago was they're still a big band, but at that time they were still a very relevant band. Mm-hmm. It was before Danny obviously had left the band, and that was a big deal. That got a lot of people's attention. And then, over time, we had a couple more guys. I want to say like Matt Cameron with Soundgarden. I think just before I left, Jason Bonham was an early convert to come over. And then I ended up leaving in the spring of '89. I'd already moved back to Boston, but I ended up going to Zildjian in the spring of '89. Was
Carlos around before you left?
Carlos, I think he was still playing Gretsch.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, like I remember. That's true. I think about that PBS thing he was playing Gretsch. That would have been about that time. Yeah,
I mean, he came up there a couple of times because so many of these guys used the hardware, so they were anyway. And I remember Chester Thompson coming up. Larry London, I was involved in when Larry came on board.
Nice.
But I remember Chester coming up, and Chester had just gone from Pearl to Sonar, and I knew him from Simmons, and so he was coming up to get some pedals, to check some stuff out. I think he wanted to buy one of the rack systems that we were distributing, this collar lock system that was Canadian at the time. I think Don ended up buying the name and the whole patent or the whole design. But so Chester came up. And we had a drum set, a DW set up, and he was checking them out. And he said, I remember he went, man, he's like going, like scratching his head going, I wish I knew about these drums. I just, and to his credit, he wasn't going to now undo his deal with Sonar. I think he was very happy at the time. And they were part of Sabian, and Sonar were sort of part of the same company. And so it all made sense to him. But I just remember he was kind of like going, man, I didn't realize you guys were kind of at this point making drums this good? And I said, yeah, it's still a little bit of a secret, but more and more people are finding out. We're trying to get the word out there. And some years later, I don't know when, but well after I'd left there, I believe Chester's now with DW. So
that sounds right. So
yeah.
Really quick, just one more question about DW. Clearly innovation and attention to detail, all these things have been a big part of their success, but the marketing end of it is just it's nobody does it better. Yeah. And give us a little insight on who's the brains behind that. Is it just it's so good, we'd be remiss in not touching on that.
Yeah, well, the guy that's doing it now, the marketing who's been their marketing person for I don't know how many years now, 15, I don't know, maybe more, Scott Donnell. But and he's a very smart guy. He's a great guy. Really knows what he's doing. He's a drummer. I met him 1,000 years ago when he worked for Remo as a low level. And that's the thing about this business. There are a lot of great people that start off somewhere and they're kind of in a low level position that they haven't really hit their stride, so to speak, and then they get an opportunity, like in a company like DW, to really shine. Mm-hmm. And Scott's, I think, a good example of that. But at that time, in the early days, there was a guy named David Levine, who actually was the Simmons marketing person back in the old days. And David, I owe a lot to him because I think he was the person or one of the people that had given Don my name as a person to consider for the DW gig. We'd worked together at Simmons, and he was like a freelance marketing guy and did a lot of those older DW ads. But I think part of the marketing, John, I think you have to give John Good a lot of credit, and Don, and that the whole pitch matching of the shells, the timbre matching, that that's something that some people I think they dismissed it as sort of like a little marketing hype or something. But mm-hmm. But that's a really strong selling point when people would come in there and John would take the shells down off the shelf and he would tap them and you could hear that he was basically matching the pitch of each. And his point was that I'm going to put these 4 shells together and they're going to work better than just 4 random shells I mean, we could make 4 random shells work. Most companies are able to do that, but why not get 4 shells that are going to be like matching 4 crash cymbals? You want to get them to be as close or compatible as possible. And
mm-hmm.
if I'm understanding the process correctly, that was John's thing, was like, let's have you come up and pick out your shells. And guys love that, And the other thing too was you'd come up and you couldn't really go to any of the big Japanese companies and look at a swatch of your finish. I mean, if you were lucky enough to be in Japan and you were at Yamaha's at the Sakai factory where Yamaha used to make their drums, you might be able to see a swatch of a certain thing and they'd say, yes, we can make this in this finish for you. But otherwise you're sort of blindly saying, I want it to be purple sapphire or something. But at DW, you'd come up and John would say, check this out. I just got this new finish and it's called this, and when you hold it under the light, it turns into this. And oh man, I have to have a whole kit like that, So there was a lot of that, and that really helped the thing catch fire. And I think the a big turning point for them was the whole alternative grunge thing of the early '90s. It became the brand that was associated with all those bands. When Dave Aberzees got the gig with Pearl Jam, I mean that was a huge push for DW, because all of a sudden DW drums that was the hottest band on the planet, and those drums were front and center everywhere, and all the bands from Seattle.
Well, I think didn't Chamberlain have one in the first video too? I think he had that, so it was like from the get go with Pearl Jam especially.
You're probably right.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure in that a live video he was playing them.
Yeah.
So that makes I never thought about that. But that whole scene, DW was a real.
Oh yeah, they were at the ground floor of all that. Yeah,
and that's crazy, awesome to think about.
So John, now you're back on the East Coast, And you've already mentioned that you had gotten the gig with Zildjian. Now, Zildjian, this is one of the cornerstone companies for our business. Absolute, as high level as it's going to get. Did you seek that gig out, or did they come to you?
They came to me. I was at the NAMM show, Winter NAMM show 1989, and I was out there on DW's dime. So I'd moved back in the fall of '88 to Boston, working for Don, and so I went out there to the NAMM show and was working the DW booth. But I know I've sort of skipped around here, but through working at Wurlitzer and just working in the industry for all those years at that point, I'd got to know many of the people at Zildjian, and one of the guys, Colin Schofield, who was the marketing person at that time, had been living in LA when I lived out there, working for Zildjian on the West Coast, and then they moved him out to Norwell. But so anyway, I bumped into Colin at their booth, and I was over there to say hello to him and to Lenny, and kind of reintroduce myself to Armin, say hello to him, and Colin said, "So you're back on the East Coast now, I heard." I said, "Yeah, it's going well. It's DW's starting to happen," and he's curious about what I was up to, and he said, "Well, do you have a resume?" And I said, "I do. I'm actually looking to pick up other lines that don't conflict." I was an independent sales rep, so I was able to sell other products that didn't conflict with DW, and obviously the more I could do, the more I'd make. And he said, "Well, I can't really get into it right now, but we may be looking to expand, but I'd like to have a resume, and I'll get in touch." So I gave him a resume. So this is January, and I want to say a couple of weeks later, maybe, I got a phone call, and he said, "Okay, look, here's the situation. We're looking to expand in artist relations, and we'd like to have you come down and meet with us and interview." And I said, "Okay, well," and I explained a little bit more about what I was doing with DW, and I said, "I am doing, some artist relations, and I'm doing a lot of sales, and it's in this particular job, I'm sort of wearing a couple of hats, but I'm certainly putting, food on the table via my sales commissions. DW is starting to happen now. I go down to New York every few weeks and write a nice big order, and that sort of thing." So I went down there and I met with him, and met a few other people there, and I'd actually never been to Zildjian, which it was kind of funny to think about. I'd grown up 20-something miles away, and I'd been invited, but I just had never been down there. So went down there, and I liked what I saw, and so we talked a little bit more about it, but they were certainly not committing to say, "You're hired." And I said, "I'm interested, but I'm still really not sure how this would all shake out for me." So anyway, I left there, and I felt, okay, I've checked it out, and it's good that I've done that, and we'll see where this goes. And in the meantime, I'd been contacted by a company called HSS, which I had referred to a minute ago, and they were the distributor for Sabian cymbals, Sonar drums, Hohner, and they were looking for a Northeast sales rep to sell Sabian, Sonar, and I was contacted by their sales manager, and my name had been thrown into the hat. So I'm talking to this guy, and he said, "I'm going to be coming up from Virginia in a couple of weeks to interview people at the airport. Would you be interested in interviewing?" And I said, "Yeah, I would be." And I told him what I was doing with DW, and his first words were, "Well, if we hire you, you'd have to resign DW. You can't sell DW and Sonar. There's a conflict there." And I said, "Well, I understand that." And I was trying to, even before I even had the job, I'm trying to negotiate, I'm saying, "Well, can I sell the hardware? Because who buys Sonar hardware? But, this is a huge part of my income," and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, "Look, if you get the job, you're going to be selling Sabian. You're going to be making a lot of money with Sabian. You're going to be selling Sonar, blah, blah, blah." And I was well aware of Sonar drums, but I also knew they were very expensive, specialized kind of drum. And I'm looking at the inroads that I'm making with DW and seeing the potential that this could really be a great financial situation with DW. So anyway, I store that away, get the phone call to come back to Zildjian for a follow-up interview, this time with Armin Zildjian. So I've advanced to the next level, so to speak. And I come down, and I'm talking to Armin, and Lenny's in the room, and I knew Lenny, and we were having this great conversation, and Armin was asking me if I, do you know Peter Erskine? Do you know Vinnie Colaiuta? Do you know Steve Smith? Dennis Chambers? And I said, yep, I know these guys, or I've certainly met them all, but I know many of them, and just getting a feel for what I was. And I'll tell you a quick funny story. At that time, Craigie Zildjian, who's now his daughter who runs the company, was the HR person. So she was in the room, and she's looking at my resume, and I could see she circled it in red and made notes and stuff. And I was getting a little nervous looking at. She's like making notes and scribbling things. And so finally she says, well, I have a question. And I've told her this story. We laugh about it. She said, I have a question. I see that, you first you were here, then you moved out to California and you worked for Simmons, and then you went to DW, and then you moved back here, and you've moved around a lot in the last 4 years or so. And how do we know you're not going to just stay here for a year or two and then move on to something else? Because we need someone who's going to be here. And I said, no, that's a fair question. I said, I moved out there to pursue playing professionally, and it just, my sort of business career took off, sort of without even realizing it. And all of a sudden I was more involved in that and not so much in playing. And then my son was born out there, and we decided we really wanted to raise him on the East Coast where we're from. And so I'm explaining it, and Armin kind of like cuts her off and says, Craigie, for crying out loud, I like this guy. Just hire him and give him whatever he wants. and I'm just sitting there kind of going, oh man. but happy, that Armin, that I passed the test with Armin, but he was that kind of guy. So, I left there basically feeling that there was some sort of offer imminent, and then I'd be contacted again about whatever the next level would be. And in the meantime, I had another discussion with the person from HSS about the interview that was coming up. He was coming up in a week or so, and was I still interested? And I said, yes, I think I would be. And in the meantime, I'd spoken with Don Lombardi, and Don was enough of a friend that I could confide in him, because I didn't want to leave him hanging. If I was going to go to work for Zildjian, I wanted to tell him, this is a possibility. So Don said to me, well, look, if the Zildjian thing is the best thing, then I understand that and you should do it. But if not, I have no problem with you selling Sonar and DW, and I'll tell the Sonar guy that. I'll just tell him, look, I have no problem with him selling both, because I think they're different enough that, and I know him well enough that he could, basically do justice to both by serving both masters, so to speak, which is probably a bit of a stretch when you think about it. But Don was willing to sort of go to bat for me. So I had this conversation with the guy at HSS, and he was not hearing any of it. He said, look, no, it's not, I appreciate that, but if, let's meet, let's see how it goes. And this is all assuming that I was going to get the job, and I shouldn't have assumed that, but he said, if we do hire you, you have to resign DW. So, I figured when I met with him, I could really sort of question him about, like, okay, what are the numbers I'm going to be looking at? What am I going to make selling Sabian? What am I going to make selling Sonar? Does it make sense for me to give up DW and the potential to do this? So at least I was armed with that when this meeting was going to come. But in that time, I got another phone call from Zildjian basically saying, okay, we want to offer you the job. We want to send you a letter of offer. And on the phone, we started negotiating salaries, and I wasn't willing to accept what they were offering me. And I think I went down there one more time for a meeting, and we hammered out. In fact, no, we still hadn't hammered it out. And I was thinking, well, I really did want the job. I had gotten to the point where I was excited about it. I liked the people there, and I liked the fact that it was Zildjian, and I liked the fact that it was artist relations. But I have to be honest with you guys. I mean, I wasn't. This might sound strange or hard to believe, but I wasn't chomping at the bit to work in a company as an artist relations manager, because I knew from being in the business long enough that there isn't the sort of potential there in terms of growth typically that there is with other positions in a company. And I wasn't being totally financially driven by my thinking, but I was thinking, I have a small child. By then our second child was on the way. And, based on what they were sort of offering initially, I thought, I'm going to be making okay money, but I'm going to be spending a lot of my personal time doing this job. Whereas as a sales guy, it's almost, the potential's almost limitless until, if I work hard enough, I can make a lot of money here. I knew what I could do. So I kind of had that in my back pocket, knowing that, which was good for me. And I'll just tell you that a very good friend of mine, Joe McSweeney, who used to own Eames Drums, he just sold the company a couple of years ago, but I went up to see Joe one day during all this, and I had lunch with him, and he was the only person I confided in what was going on. And he said to me, John, that's what Ralph Eames would call a good situation to be in. So, it was like, he just sort of like, he said, you have nothing to complain about here. Like, you have nothing to worry about. You're going to, one way or another, you're going to be okay in this thing. And he was right. I thought, okay, worst case is I just continue to, not worst case, but I have this situation at DW that's definitely going to do something, or I've got two other potential things. So anyway, I did finally come to an agreement with Zildjian in terms of the salary, and I accepted that position. I then made the phone call to the person at HSS and said, I'm going to withdraw from, my candidacy for this position, and, not do the interview. And when he asked me why, I told him why, and he was not very happy with me. But, years later, we became actually good friends in the industry, but we sort of laughed about it. But, I didn't string him along because we hadn't actually met yet. You know what I mean? It wasn't like I interviewed and then he said, yes, we want you. And then I strung him along. I basically was waiting until the last minute to let him know that. So anyway, I accepted the position, and I started there in May of 1989 as Artist Relations Manager, East Coast. And there was an office, there's an office on the West Coast. And my counterpart at that time in the West Coast office was a guy named Mike Morse, who tragically passed away just last week. Really, really good guy and good friend. And I'd known Mike he used to work at Guitar Center Hollywood, and we had this history. So he was tickled that I was now going to be his East Coast counterpoint, and we could bounce ideas off each other and work together and, be a really strong team. So
awesome.
Sorry to hear that. So,
Yeah,
so the, you go from two almost upstart companies. Then you have to convince your wife to join another upstart company, right? I'm sure that was difficult. Wait a minute. No. So, Zildjian, look, that's it, the pinnacle, and certainly understand in the position you were in and the limitless possibilities, but there is some clear stability and, their proven history. And, we all kind of know, you mentioned your friend Mike, but there's some storied characters in Zildjian that, I think you have a pretty unique perspective on. You mentioned Lenny. Talk a little bit about Lenny and his.
Lenny was just an amazing guy. I shouldn't say he doesn't get the credit, because I think he does get the credit. In terms of his knowledge of his knowledge of the product, and he was there certainly at the ground level of when the British invasion happened and the whole rock thing exploded in the 60s. Lenny was the guy that was signing up all the drummers, picking all the cymbals for the drummers. He was in the trenches even in those days in terms of like the advertising and naming some of the, deciding to call this a swish or call this a that, or a lot of things that maybe people don't realize about Lenny. They maybe just think of him as a storied, legendary guy that was the artist relations guy for a long time, but he was a big part of the early days of I say early days. The company had already been around for a couple hundred years, but I mean, he was certainly there when it turned that corner.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just a whole new market that.
Yeah, exactly. And I, when I came in there, I tell people this, that I was lucky that Lenny had built this great program, and that over time, I came in at a time when, and I left this out because my question when they were approaching me about this job was, well, what about Lenny? And they said, Lenny's still going to be very involved with artists, but he's moving more toward education. We're creating this new area that we need to focus on, which is education. And later he became a big part of the whole orchestral part of Zildjian. But they said we want somebody that can be out there hunting down all those young bands and new bands and getting out there and seeing everybody 5 or 6 nights a week when they come through town and like that. So I came in there at a time when, to use the analogy of Lenny handing me the keys. I mean, he sort of passed me the baton in terms of having a great program already in place that I could build on. And I feel fortunate I was able to build on it further and make it kind of more of my own thing, but certainly with the tradition that Lenny and Armin had created there in terms of how we treated artists, what was most important. But the thing about Lenny, I said this right up until he passed away, and I say it even after now that he's been gone, but he didn't have a mean bone in his body, nor should he, or nor should anyone, but you couldn't rattle his cage, I guess is what I'm getting at. There'd be days where everybody's patience would be tested by something that happened. This phone call from this guy, or somebody calling us at 5 minutes to 5 on a Friday saying, I need cymbals in Boise, Idaho tomorrow for this XYZ drummer. And somebody's got to go to the FedEx terminal 20 miles away and bring them there. Or else it's going to, or there's trouble. And Lenny he never got unnerved by anything. He'd say, well, Johnny, yeah, sometimes this stuff happens and you just got to roll with it, And he could roll with it. He could roll with it like anybody. I'll tell you, there were a lot of changes that happened over the years that I was there with management. And, you'd have one person in charge, and then all of a sudden that person's gone and they'd bring a new person in. And that new person would want to change half of what we did and say, well, let's not do it that way anymore. Let's do it this way. And Lenny used to say to me, you know what, Johnny, every few years, I forget the term that he used, but he had all these great little sayings, these little isms, and he'd say that it's the 3-year shuffle. You just gotta let it go. It's a little shuffle. Just roll with it. He'll be gone. We'll still be here. We'll still be doing our thing.
Okay, gang, that is it for part 1, but we are just getting started. For part 2, we're going to talk about more drumming and more industry legends. You're going to hear great stories, great personal accounts of different interactions with different manufacturers and artists. We're also going to cover topics that I absolutely know you're going to want to hear about endorsements, how to get endorsements, how not to get endorsements. Talk about clinic tours that John's been on, and we're also going to talk about how technology has changed everything from selling to clinics to the educational aspect. You're definitely going to want to tune in for part 2. It's a can't miss. Before we go, don't forget, once again, when you're listening to this, you've probably got less than 72 hours to sign up for our 1-year anniversary giveaway. We are partnering with Monk Drums. These great artisan manufacturers are supplying us with 2 great prizes. First prize is an original 10-inch Monk drum. Second prize is a set of Monk drum bongos. Please go to monkdrums.com. Take a look at those things. If you haven't seen them, you're going to be blown away when you see and hear them. There's videos and plenty of pics on their site. So go over to monkdrums.com and get a look. Then you're asking, well, my gosh, how do I end up winning one of these wonderful artisan quality instruments? Here's what you do. You sign into iTunes and you go over to the Drummers Weekly Groovecast page inside of iTunes and you leave us a short written review. We're going to take your iTunes nickname, throw it into a hat. We're going to draw out 2 lucky winners. Hopefully you'll be one of them. We're going to let you know here in just a couple of days what time we're going to be when and what time we're going to be drawing. We're going to do it live on Facebook, so keep your eyes close to our social media page and we'll send you plenty of information regarding when that's going to happen. Then last but not least, always stay in touch with us. Communicate with us at your peril. You can email us at our traditional email account, drummersweeklygroovecast@gmail.com, or you can interact with us on Facebook, facebook.com/Drummers Weekly Groovecast. And of course, if you're someone who likes to speak in 140 characters or less, tweet us at Twitter, twitter.com/DW Groovecast. Follow us while you're there. All right, that's it for this week. Join us back here next week for part 2 of our interview with John DeChristopher.